Number 1. This may interest some of you. It's not really much of a story. Not yet. The thing is, in the city I live, there are many old abandoned factories. Some of them were like that for decades. I'm living in a district where there are a few near me. Some of them were demolished, and some were renewed, and there are now apartments in them. But among them, there are a few that, for some reason, were left untouched. I once decided to go into one of them. It was quite small, once a shoe factory, or something like that. We managed to break in, and pick related. So yeah, first floor was kind of disappointing. Nothing really interesting there. And really there wasn't access for the whole building. The end was the bigger room, with a pile of rubbish, and a hole in a wall. We presumed it's the way up, and we were not wrong. All we had to do was stockpile some stuff near it, and somehow squeeze through. This is where it hit me. Later, my friend told me he felt the same. That fucking uneasy feeling. There was something wrong, but hell, we both thought that the other one didn't give a fuck. So we both didn't say anything. Now, light was terrible, and my friend only took a couple shitty photos that showed nothing. Well, he took the two that can give you a look into what weird stuff we walked in. Anyway, first room was normal. Nothing there, just some rubbish lying around. And then we walked into the second, larger room. This is when it became weird as fuck. There was none of this shit on the first floor, and now the whole fucking floor was covered in styrofoam, with these strange symbols on them. The whole fucking walls were covered by those symbols. Yeah, it may not sound scary at all, but being there, combined with that weird feeling, has fucking done it. There was something really wrong with this place, and we knew it. I mean, who the hell covers a whole room with such shit? But we decided to keep on. This is also where the friend's phone died. I didn't even bring one with me, since I lived near, and I didn't really have the need. Only thing that we had was a cheap lighter. Anyway, those fucking drawings. They were also in the other room. More symbols and those weird fucking fetus-like things. Shit was unsettling at the very least. And the thing is, I only realized it then, that it almost felt as someone was watching me. Which was absurd since there was no way to look into that building just like that. We roamed the second floor like that, looking at those weird symbols and fetuses. Nothing much really except those. So we decided to slowly come back, and this is when we heard something. Like a slight screech. And this is when the wind put out our lighter. In split seconds, we both figured that there was no fucking wind in this building earlier. Not even the slightest draft. Maybe we were both just paranoid, but we simultaneously noped as fuck. I don't really remember. I think I saw some movement the moment we escaped through the hole to the first floor. But that was probably nerves and all. It was dark, and the atmosphere was weirding us out, and we lost our reason once we decided to get out of there anyway. Although this place can't leave my mind, I don't think it's the only one like that. I think I will prepare, and I will check out the other factories. Maybe I will go back to this one. Maybe during a day. For sure, I am not coming here alone. Number 2.
This was probably 10 years ago, and I wish I could tell this story properly. This was the one night in my life I was truly wondering whether I would die or not. For the backstory, Our location is basically in the middle of nowhere, Minnesota, and 30 minutes from the nearest town big enough for a Walmart, and an hour away from any town big enough to have a normal, albeit small mall. I hope that gives you an idea on how middle of nowhere we were. I had this friend, Brandon, who was my main shooting friend. It seemed like we'd always launch off about 1,000 rounds of .22 long rifle at gravel pits every couple weeks. We trusted each other like I've never experienced as far as firearms and general camaraderie. He had a history of being kind of a troublemaker, but was fine around me. Partially at least, because we didn't go see his other friends while I was with him. They were kind of a bunch of douchebags, and I didn't want anything to do with them for the most part. He has since abandoned them and realizes that they were nothing but bad influences. On to the real story. So, one afternoon when we hung out, Brandon mentioned this abandoned farm site that had a lot of rabbits to hunt and a couple of old buildings. So, of course, we decided we'd go a little later and hunt and see what we could find. It was supposedly full of rabbits every time he'd been there. The catch that day was that there was a new guy in our normally two-man group, a cousin that Brandon wasn't very fond of. Brandon thought he was kind of an idiot, and my opinion would be equally low by the end of the day. His name was Travis, and he really was an idiot. I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt, but this kid really was a dumb neckbeard, and it didn't take long for me to realize it. Anyway, later in the afternoon, we took off for the abandoned farm site. We parked the truck at the end of the driveway to keep the element of surprise, and snuck up the driveway as quietly as possible. It was probably a little under 200 yards to the actual abandoned farm site from the end of the driveway. About half of the length of the driveway was corn taller than us. The other half was the thin driveway surrounded by trees on both sides. On one side of the driveway was the main grove. The other was a 10-foot thick wall of trees with tall corn on the other side. It was late afternoon, not too far from sunset, so we had a spotlight with us in case we stayed past dark. After the end of that day, I'd wish we'd left it at home. This is where it all really begins. We walked up the thin driveway surrounded by trees on both sides and eventually broke off and checked out the woods together. There were a lot of details that we noticed as the day went that were not quite right about the place. But we didn't really put it all together until it turned into the crazy night trapped up on that farm site. We went through the large section of woods first. There were paths already made and plants that looked like they'd just been broken off because they were still bleeding water from where it had been snapped. We figured it was some deer or something that we'd scared up. As we went to the barn, we noticed claw marks all over the ladder to get upstairs, and pretty much zero cobwebs or signs of life, other than those claw marks on the ladder rungs. Actually, there were no rabbits or any life whatsoever. It seemed like no birds, squirrels, or anything, not even flies or spiders. We did think that was a little on the weird side for an abandoned farm. There's not generally a lot going on at abandoned places, but this was on a whole different level. As time passed, it started to get dark. We had been shooting on and off at different pieces of junk lying around for most of the time we had been there, maybe 2 hours. We had 2 Ruger 1022s between the 3 of us, and my 870 pump shotgun. Travis didn't have his own gun, so he used whatever we gave him at the time, usually a 22. As night set in, we grabbed the spotlight and kept exploring around the edges of the woods and behind the buildings. The spotlight was dead in about 5 minutes, even though we didn't use it much. The battery must have been crap. We were about to call it a night when we heard something rustling in the woods past some shrubby trees. We kept hearing the noise, so we shot into the area and it stopped for a minute. Then it came back again somewhere else, but in the same general direction. Because we were so curious about this noise, we stayed past dark because we figured it was kind of a fun excuse to keep going. By now, it was very dark, but it was a full moon, so we could still see fairly well. But we could see absolutely nothing in the woods, inside of the buildings, or anywhere inside the shadows. We kept hearing the thing running around and moving through the woods with more and more frequency as time went on. It would go away for a few minutes, then we'd hear it on the other side of the clearing behind us. It was at this point that we started to get freaked out because we kept hearing it change places every few minutes, and it seemed to be stalking us. Eventually, we saw it jump out of the woods a foot or two, then dart back in. We couldn't tell what it was, but it glared a silverish and pale color in the moonlight. It was the size of a medium-large dog, but quick as a cat. Now, we knew this wasn't just us hearing things, and of course, freaked us out even more. This went on for a long time, with us just standing there, trying to figure out how to get out of this mess. We were all scared shitless for hours, shooting in the shadows, occasionally trying to hit it. And of course, we didn't want to go down the thin driveway with trees on both sides of it and almost no light. We couldn't even get a hint of light from the spotlight by this time. We were prepared to stay there all night, keeping guard if we had to. And keep in mind, at the time, cell phones were almost unheard of for most people, so we didn't have any communication out there. If we did, we would have definitely used it by the end. An hour or two into the darkened night, we started hearing this thing from two places at once, or from both sides, too fast for it to only be one thing crunching around out there. We stood there and kind of backed off from the noises we were hearing because it's natural instinct to back away, but we soon realized it was trying to push us into a thinner clearing, and we were almost sure that it meant to do that. I'm sure they wanted to get us somewhere where they could attack us from all sides quickly. From that point forward, we just stayed in the center of the largest clearing no matter what we heard. At least there'd be about 10 to 15 yards between us and the woods in all directions. We'd have time to shoot at anything that came for us from that distance. Eventually, around midnight to 1 a.m., we decided we'd make a run for it down the driveway. We were low on ammo and starting to get more worried as time passed. We decided that the three of us would go back to back in a triangle formation, covering all sides on our escape. We were 100% convinced that if we got close to the woods, they would come after us, so we were faced with a tough decision, with a thin driveway being our only escape. Whatever these things were, they seemed damn fast, unfriendly, and unafraid of gunfire. We'd finally made the decision to abandon the spotlight, each take a gun and make our escape. Travis and I would have the .22s, and Brandon would carry my 20 gauge. Unfortunately, Travis wouldn't abandon the dead spotlight, so he took it with him for some reason. He was clutching onto a dead spotlight more than his rifle, and we couldn't convince him to set it down, even though it had 0 charge. You couldn't even get a flicker of light from it. Finally, we just decided he could take it with him on the way down the driveway. We just wanted to get the hell out of there. We were just about to leave, and that's when we heard the noises from both sides again, and within a few seconds, I saw one of them run across the clearing on the far rise of the farm site. That was not good news. It was scary enough that there might be 2. Now we'd pretty much confirmed that there were at least 3 of them. We made up our minds quickly and without wasting time went back to back and started down the driveway while we knew at least one was on the opposite side of the farm and ran the wrong way to intercept us on the driveway. Another was also on the side of the farm that we would move away from. So 2 of our 3 monsters were at as much disadvantage as possible. We finally took off. We were making a slow escape with Brandon and I facing the main section of the woods, and with Travis facing the field because we wanted to be the pens facing the most likely point of attack. Travis was too scared to handle anything but a dead spotlight, and really couldn't have aimed and shot if he had wanted to, because he was clutching that damn spotlight like it was his salvation. As we went along, we heard them running alongside us on the larger side of the grove, and we were really wondering if trying to escape had been a good idea or not. We were about halfway down the driveway when one of them actually lunged at Brandon and my side. Brandon pretty much instantly fired the 20 gauge in surprise, and the critter ran off. I'm sure it ran off only because the gun blast surprised it just as much. It was there and gone so fast that we still didn't know what it was exactly. But we were still as scared as we'd ever been because the woods were less than 10 feet away on either side of us, and those things were fast as hell. After we cleared the grove, we actually didn't hear anything in the corn rows next to us, but that doesn't mean much. It's not hard for an animal to move quietly on black dirt between the rows. After a few terrifying minutes, we eventually made it to the vehicle, threw our stuff in, and rolled up the windows. We breathed a sigh of relief and tried to figure out what the hell just happened for a good while before starting the engine and heading back to his place. We actually decided to go back the same night after dropping off Travis at his uncle's place. We took a car instead of the pickup, rolled up the windows, and drove up the driveway. I actually saw one of them lunge towards my window quickly and bolt back into the woods once while going up the driveway, roughly the same spot it went after us when on foot. That was the last we saw of them with our eyes. It was so fast that I still couldn't tell what it was. I can still replay that moment in my head vividly. Once we got up the driveway, we parked up next to the woods and rolled down my window a crack so we could hear better. I bet the damn thing was 6 feet away from my passenger window a few times, but I could never see it in the dim moonlight. But I could sure as hell hear it, and so could Brandon. We tried to flash the car's lights a couple times just to try and catch one in the open, but we never had the right timing. A day later, we brought the truck back up and camped out in the back. We wanted to kill one of these things and figure out what it was. We thought maybe one of them was out there, but we never could really tell for sure if we were just paranoid and hearing things at some points. We thought we may have heard them, but there was also a breeze, so it could have just been swaying branches. To this day, I still have no idea what it was. We're in west central Minnesota, and our only ideas of what it could be are some of the mountain lions rumored to be out in the area, or possibly wolves. The reason we thought mountain lions is just because they had such cat-like speed, and supposedly they've been sighted around here before. In the end, I'll never know for sure, but I would never trade that experience for anything else.
Number 3. Entities me and my neighbors had to deal with back in 2005. Moving to house in the outback in South Australia in 2005. Pretty much every single person living in our street had only lived there for under 5 years, apart from an elderly couple that lived at the end of the street. This elderly couple had lived in the street for 40 years and had raised their children in the street. They said strange things happened in that street, and a lot of people can't handle it and they leave. They never really went into what scared people, just saying the whole street was haunted or something like that. But they did say that it only started happening in the early 90s. First experience I had was a week after moving in. I heard a low-pitched humming sound coming from outside my bedroom window. When I looked out, I saw this tall black figure with long arms and long fingers, with no facial features. He was slightly transparent. He was backed up against the wall, holding up the garage area of my house. Due to its height, he had to hunch over. I was looking out for around 5 seconds before it realized I was looking at it. It turned its head towards me, and I quickly ran away from the window and ran and told my parents. My dad went out and saw that nothing was there. I sketched what I saw, pic related. I started hanging out with the neighborhood kids. We were all teenagers, and they told me their stories, and all described the same figures that I had seen. One of the kids was Aboriginal, and we would go visit his grandfather a lot. He called the entities Mayalamula, which translated roughly to stranger man. He said that the Aboriginals in the area had been dealing with them long before the arrival of Europeans, and said that they weren't of the land, which kind of meant that they didn't belong there, or weren't native to there, and that they would take children away and eat them. He said that the Aboriginals cast them behind the creek, but since the creek partially dried up, the Mayalmula had once again been able to get into the town. The town that I lived in was built directly over the previous Aboriginal settlement. This Aboriginal tribe wasn't nomadic and had remained in a small area for over 1,000 years. One day, me and my friends were playing cricket out on the flat patch of desert in between the road and my house. The sun was setting, and as we were packing up our stuff, we noticed that there were people off in the distance, approaching the road. The closer they got, the more details we could see, and we noticed that they were fully black, tall, and that they weren't walking, but instead floating. We could also hear a low-pitched humming sound that got louder the closer they got. We bolted back to my house and told my parents, but my parents once again didn't believe us. I hassled my father enough to drive down on his motorbike to the area that we saw them approaching. After 9 minutes, he came back to the house, visibly shaken, saying that he saw them and that I wasn't to go down there anymore. Every time I tried to get details on what happened, he would always change the subject. One night, I was coming home from a party with my friends, and as we passed the empty lot in the street, we saw these two small figures sitting on tree stumps, just staring at us. One was bigger than the other, and once again, we heard that low-pitched humming sound. We were all high as fuck, and were just standing there, laughing and thinking that we were tripping out, until we realized that we were all seeing the exact same thing, and we couldn't all be hallucinating the same thing. One of my mates took a step towards the one closer to us, and when he did, it made this very deep growl. I had never heard anything like it. And to make a long story short, we screamed and ran to my house. I'm mentioning this because, unlike the tall figures that I had seen, and I'd seen them a lot at night, these things were completely physical and not transparent. They were shaped like babies, but they didn't have a neck. Now this is where shit heats up. There used to be a group of kids that would take their dirt bikes beyond the creek and would go riding way out in the desert. One day, they didn't come home, and everyone assumed that they had just gotten lost. They were found a week later, all 5 of them. They were alive, with no food and no water out in the Australian outback for a week. What scared me was what one of the kids' younger brothers told me. He said that his brother had said they saw a light out in the desert, and they felt compelled to follow it. He said he felt like he was in a trance, and they didn't stop following this light for the entire week they were out in the outback. He said no matter how far they kept traveling, they didn't seem to get anywhere close to it. He said if the farmer that found them hadn't have found them, that they never would have stopped following the light, and eventually would have died. Anyway, getting to the final part of the story. So my mother had gotten sick of me being scared all the time, and called her sister, who lived in Adelaide, to come visit. She's a psychic or something. So she comes down, and the moment she pulls up, she tells us not to tell her anything about what we've seen, and that she's going to wander around the street for a while, and come back and tell us what she saw. When she came back, she was visibly shaken. She told me that these things were unlike anything that she had ever experienced, and that she had also run into the spirit of an old Aboriginal woman. The woman told her that her tribe were a split-off group from the Tharawal, and came to the area that would become the town that I lived in to escape the Mayalamula, but the Mayalamula followed them. The woman then showed her horrific images of these things, slaughtering Aboriginal children and eating them through a small slit in their mouth. The woman then told her she drowned herself in the creek, so she would act as a spiritual barrier to keep the Mayamula out. She said this worked until a pyramid-shaped pathway was built facing the way the Mayamula had come from. This allowed them to come back in once again, not the fact that the creek had dried up. The Aboriginal woman led my auntie down the path to show her something even more terrifying. After eating the small children, they would rebirth these kids to be their minions or some shit. My auntie said these beings are completely physical and live out in the desert, and sometimes come into the town for food. She said these things are harmless and mainly just keep an eye out on people for the Mayamula. My auntie became confused and said if they were killing children just to make them into spies, then what was their motive in the first place? It was explained to her that the Mayamula just seemed intent of inflicting pain and suffering on people. She said they would assault women and men alike, make women miscarriage, cause accidents, and kill the weak. Despite this, they seemed to have a personal vendetta against the Aboriginal women's tribe, and seem intent on wiping them out. And this is why they remain focused on the town. My auntie came to the conclusion that the Mayamula aren't human spirits, and aren't spirits at all. She believed that they were a physical, reproducing race of beings, and are most likely aliens. She said that she had heard of similar beings all around the world. After hearing all of this, we put the house on the market and began preparations to leave. A couple of days before we left, I went on one last motorbike ride where my father had told me not to go. While riding along a dirt path, I saw this rock on the side of the path. It was weird because it looked like it was smoothed down a bit and had some markings on it. I don't know if it's related at all to what had been happening. I personally think it's someone playing a joke, because none of the engravings on it are Aboriginal, and the engravings on it are all over the place. Anyways, I took it with me when we moved. Pig related. So, yeah, this is my experience with the paranormal. Thought I would share it with you all, and it would be great if someone else had an experience like this that they could share.